Nicodemus here. We are diving into the subject of seeking love and the dark side of the sex drive.
If we start with the idea, a theory, if you will, that everything that's plaguing the planet today, the chaos that we see, the lying, the greed, the difference in power, the monetary system, the the structures of class and all of it very much has as its root the sex drive. And really, in a lot of ways, what we're witnessing is the dark side of the sex drive. If you look at the underbelly of the planet and really the horrors of child trafficking, of prostitution, pornography, rape, violence, drug addiction, the breaking up of the family, people seeking constant validation from the world and competition and chasing after more for me, and the center of narcissism and the inner focus and, me dominating the world, all of that has at its very core. What Freud was talking about was to seek validation in sex, to get, is really, it's like, think of it, whether it's men chasing after money to get the woman or the woman chasing after whatever it is to get the love, to get the man, all of this, all these dynamics that are playing out. Really, at its core, it's a human being looking for love at our very depth in our heart, and it getting very much intertwined with our sex drive, the seeking out of sex, the seeking out of the orgasm. In the East, they call the orgasm the little death, because in the moment of the orgasm, there's this, freedom, there's this expansion just in that moment. It doesn't really last very long, and people are set up to keep chasing after it, whether it's through porn, whether it's through casual sex. And you look at what is happening with women and, the OnlyFans, pornography, the destruction of the family. All of this has at its very root this conversation. So if we go back to the beginning and start to look at where does this play out, and how does it play out, we're going to take it back to from birth. We're going to take it back to family structures and how we learned that really what is a conditioning that at its height and its climax, with people and their compulsion, it can really wreck lives. I know many people, I've worked with many people, men, women, where marriages were destructed and families broke down, all because this pull towards sex and really union. When we say seeking love, we're looking for union. It's just we're looking through it through bodies and through the orgasm, through the sexual release. In its extreme, it can destroy lives. People end up alcohol, people end up on drugs, because that thrill, they end up seeking the thrill through the sex drive. And when they stop getting it, they need other things that they add. And that's why a lot of people who are really acting out at very extreme levels are doing things like cocaine and prostitutes, even though they might be married, even though they might say that they love their wife or their husband, or, I love my family, let's say they might say. And ultimately, that pull is so deep that they'll sacrifice and risk all the things that they love for it. If we understand that, we could start to have a conversation about what it is, where it comes from, and how to rectify it, so that we can ultimately, through healing this, we can ultimately live a life of freedom, a life of fulfillment, a life of intimacy, connection. And it frees us up to deepen our connection to life. It frees us up to ultimately live a life that is built on love, that's built on harmony, that isn't about chasing after something that ultimately, in the end, we can never get enough of. I start with my story. I was probably be considered highly sexualized at a very young age. I remember my mom making comments like jokes. I came out right away. I was very much always like, love to talk to girls. And I can even remember in, nursery school, looking up a teacher's dress, just really interesting hypersexualization. I was a very sensitive kid. And I think by around 3, 4, 5 years old, I started to really feel the density and heaviness of I want to call it the mood or the conversation of sex around, we could call it like a drift, a current, or, water drifts, or there's a stream, a current. There's this undercurrent of sexuality, and especially, actually, really worldwide. I'd say each culture has its own way about it. Growing up Middle Eastern and Italian, especially on the Middle Eastern side, the men were very much how you could describe as whether pigs, cheaters. It just seemed to be around. And I had older cousins, and they were always about girls and getting girls and everyone around us. And I felt it very early on. Really, it was intense. And then you take that and you mix in seeing porn at a young age, maybe 6 years old, 7 years old. And, at that really very early on, little boys are taught to objectify. So, and little girls are taught to be objects of affection, to get attention, to get love. This isn't a hard rule, especially in this day and age. I know there's a lot of conversations on, gender and all this stuff. But if we just look at it, the society, and especially when growing up in the last, let's say 30, 40 years, and, the 50s and the 60s, the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of boys were taught to objectify, little girls are taught to be objects of affection. So for me, I was very driven, very competitive, and girls at a very young age became everything. Really, girls in sports, but even sports, as we're having this conversation, sports were to get the girls and to get the attention, right? If you were good at sports, the girls liked you. And then, I can't even remember watching dramas and love shows and all this stuff very early on, whether it was my mom or I loved romance stuff. And it's very much a conditioning. And it turns out that everybody is under this conditioning. Hollywood constantly fosters it. And it's about seeking love, seeking sex, the mixing of the two. And it sets us up for some really, if you're not aware that this is happening, like myself, you go down some dark paths. And it's taken me to some really interesting places. Now, in the beginning, it started out great talk. I always had a lot of friends that were girls that could talk to girls, and became really great with girls and women as I got older. And it became like a sport, which was really interesting, because growing up as really an athlete, and then a basketball player, and being a top basketball player for my age group where I grew up, and then in the country, and super driven, it was though when I walked away from sports, women replaced it. So now you start to see, and I could see so much of the anxiety, so much of the fear, so much of the restlessness and the nervousness. I look back and realize that it was very much a twisted sex drive. Let's just call it that, or a twisted sex drive. It was very much rooted in the early days. Now, you might remember this too. I mean, I can remember when you're a young boy, there's this like coveting, longing, because you're being bombarded with these images of things that you first off can't have. So now it's set up in scarcity, because right off the bat, I mean, you're 6, 7, 8 years old, 9 years old. I mean, I can just remember wanting to have sex so bad, just wanting it so bad, being really young, and it's like there's no, what can you even do about that? There's no, I mean, what do you then what are you resorting to? You're resorting to masturbation. You're starting with images. Maybe it doesn't even start so much with images. You might just start with fantasies, right? I can remember in just starting with maybe the girl at school. Maybe it was this an older, like a mother, whatever it is. Your mind starts to put together pictures and fantasies, but you see that runs out really fast. So then we're like magazines, and then before you know it, it gets harder and harder and climbs slowly over the years. And you think about a young boy, the level of, first off, it's so considered so normal, right? Everybody does it. It's almost you're not normal if you don't do it. You're abnormal if you don't do it. Well, think about that. You're one of the most profound acts of sexual release, which is to create life, and all of the release of dopamine and oxytocin and the chemicals in the brain. It's literally like we're hijacking our brain to pretend that we're doing this very important act that is ingrained in our DNA, and we're doing it over and over again. And the crazy thing is when you're jerking off, masturbating by yourself, self-pleasuring, you're releasing dopamine. It's not even the same as if you're making love to someone that you love. So now you're hooked up as a young child to dopamine. Now, we didn't have iPhones back in the day. We still had TV and some computer stuff, but that, you look at even now today, the level of the dopamine, and then you mix that in. Now you're setting a child up to hook up to literally like a drug factory in their brain. And that's what happened to me. And it started off really exciting. Well, actually, let's say this. Let's back up. It started off in scarcity, longing. Gosh, if I could just say, we used to, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit, and oh my gosh, when it was in the library, who'd go look at it, we would have the Sports Illustrated, and when the swimsuit edition would come, it was like, it was like Christmas, it was, the Kathy Ireland and the Christy Brinkley's, good Lord, it was literally like looking at a god or a goddess, really a goddess. Just this exalted aura of, I want that and I can't have it. Now, that starts off where you can't wait for it to happen. And when it does happen, and how it happened for me, I started off with really like the prettiest girl in the town who was older, who I was like, I would do anything to be with her. And then I was, and then that wore out really fast. And then the next pretty girl, and it was like a never ending cycle. And there was a time and a moment that it started out in scarcity. Then I was like a top athlete with it. And then it got dark. And that's how this book came about.